This episode contains narratives of a cult organization that may be disturbing for some people. Listener discretion is advised. Most of us have heard the phrase, "don't drink the Kool-Aid," which means don't believe crazy and potentially dangerous ideas or people. Every day, people fall victim to charismatic, narcissistic men and women who use the guise of religion to gain followers, power, and money. We call these offenders cult leaders, and their organizations cults. It never looks like a cult in the beginning, but it always has the potential to end in tragedy. This is the history behind the crime. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of The History Behind the Crime. I'm Erin Lasley. Since the last episode, we've picked up a few listeners, and I just want to say welcome and thank you for listening. I'm here again today with Maggie, so maybe she'll be as vocal or not as vocal as the last episode. The weather's finally cooled down here in Tacoma, and in a few more weeks, I'm going to break out the hoodies and the fluffy socks. Guys, I'm a sucker for fall. No, I'm not the pumpkin spice latte, schizoid. I am a hoodie, beanie, cool Saturday afternoon, going to the local breweries, admiring the leaves, and of course, Halloween, the best holiday of the year. I'm a nut for Halloween. Do you know that feeling that you get after Christmas? You're kind of bummed because the anticipation is over. Yeah, that's me on Halloween. I decorate my office, not my house because I don't get trick-or-treaters and I live in an apartment. But I decorate my office like a fiend and buy a crap load of candy that I'm normally the only one eating. Halloween's my jam, and I can't wait this year. The craft stores already have their Halloween decorations out, and I am so right there. I've already bought the first skeleton of the year. Okay. So cults. A couple weeks ago, a local article caught my eye about the FBI raiding a church here in Tacoma. And you bet your sweet ass I clicked on that beauty, read the article, and promptly called my dad. Dad, I think I almost joined a cult. A few years ago, I was looking for a new church to attend in the area because I was brand new. And some people from work recommended the House of Prayer because the church was apparently veteran friendly. Okay, I went, I listened to a sermon, spoke with a few people there, and someone kept mentioning their Bible school classes. And I never returned because I kept picking up this weird, rude vibe. Come to find out, the House of Prayer and its other churches across the country scammed veterans out of their GI Bill college money and monthly stipend and convinced its veteran followers to use the GI Bill to get a home loan, rent their house out, and give all the rent money to the church. What the church would also do, pretty much, hey, we have these Bible classes and you can use your GI Bill to pay for them. But the classes weren't transferable. The credits weren't. So you couldn't take those credits and move to a different college. And they would just teach the same thing over and over again, but just rename the classes so they could keep defrauding the GI Bill, the VA. The church also set up barracks for its members to live in because, they all rented out their houses. And members were expected to slave away at the church after they were done with their regular jobs. The cult leader, Ronnie Dennis, he, on the other hand, owned a few luxury houses and cars paid for by his congregants. A lot's still coming out about the House of Prayer, but so far it's simple to see that Ronnie Dennis and others preyed on veterans and their beliefs in order to line their pockets. If that's not sick enough, Dennis and others shamed military sexual assault survivors, saying that if they had more faith in Dennis and the House of Prayer, they wouldn't have been raped. Asshole. But that all got me thinking about cults. Cults in general. And there's been a lot of them over the years. Some are pretty harmless. They're just different kind of people worshiping the way they want to worship, which is cool. It may seem strange to us, but, it's pretty harmless. Some are incredibly dangerous and involve cases of fraud, abuse, child marriage and rape, and murder. If you want to watch a really cool series, I recommend the show People Magazine Investigates Cults. I found it on Discovery Plus, and I think I've watched it 2 times all the way through. They feature a few cults that you probably never heard of before. There were some I had never even heard of before. And Netflix also recently released a show called Keep Sweet, Pray, and Obey. And gag. It's about Warren Jeffs and his messed up idea of fundamentalist Mormon ideology. The creep not only married his own father's wives, but married children as well. In fact, to this day, now that he's in prison, his wives still perform sexual favors for him over the phone. It's pretty damn nasty. But on this episode, I want to spend some time on the mother of all pop culture cults, the People's Temple, otherwise known as Jonestown. Just quickly, once again, listener discretion is advised. Before we pursue Jim Jones and a whole bunch of what the hell, let's look at the history of cults. Because, I do claim that this is a true crime history podcast. When a lot of people hear the word cult, they automatically summon up visions of the Manson family or the Moonies. But cults have been around pretty much from the beginning of mankind. And I got a lot of information from Robert Schroeder's book, The History of Cults, From Satanic Sects to the Manson Family. Before the formation of organized religions, or at least what we think of as organized religions today, early man adopted the belief in the mystical. Gods and goddesses were behind everything, from the sun coming up in the morning, finding a mate to club over the head and drag her back to your cave, to the sickness spreading around the neighborhood. If you farted, a mystical being was behind it. And, just like today, early man looked to godly men and women to interpret signs from the above. As more and more people adopted a more agricultural lifestyle, religion started to solidify. And yeah, this is a very basic history of religion. More and more gods and goddesses started to spring up, and of course, everyone had their favorite. Your favorite god or goddess probably had their own cults. These deity fans didn't necessarily believe their god was the only one, unless we're talking about the Egyptian cult of Akhetaten, which in that case, it was a monotheistic religion, which was pretty much blasphemy in ancient Egypt. And yeah, that's okay. I nerded out there a little bit. Think of these cults as super fans. They lived to serve their favorite deity, even though they still believed in other gods and goddesses. Did these super fan clubs get a little crazy at times? Yeah. I mean, look at the cult of Dionysus. These people were partying it up all the time with their wine and their orgies that they're almost partying themselves to death, which I guess is one way to go. Deities were not the only ones to get cults. People formed cults to worship their favorite trees or their favorite animals. The amount of cults to celebrate bulls throughout Europe would surprise you. And I won't go into some of the nasty things ancients did to honor bulls. Okay, yeah, I will. Bulls' testicles were a very special prize within some Mediterranean bull cults. And if someone gave you the gift of bull balls, that was a pretty great gift back then. Some initiates into one particular bull cult, so they would lay themselves down into this pit, and a bull would be led to stand over them, and its throat would be cut, and the initiates would bathe in the blood of this freshly sacrificed bull. Fun ancient times. Cults didn't only come from Europe either. Tribes in the Americas formed some pretty violent cults that can only be described as death cults. Yes, sacrificing humans in order to appease your god. The Aztecs were the most famous for this. They would go to war, take as many prisoners as possible, just to sacrifice them all to the sun god, whose name I'm not going to even attempt to pronounce. In 1487 alone, the Aztecs sacrificed more than 20,000 captives and then impaled their heads on skull racks. Super fun. But don't you worry, Christians. Your time came soon after the Roman and Greek cults went out of style. One of the earlier Christian cults was known as the Waldensians. They were named after their founder, Peter Waldo. They were pretty much the first pseudo-Protestant push in Europe, starting in 1176, when they rejected Mass, because a lot of people didn't understand the Latin Mass anyway, got rid of confession and excommunication, which the Catholic Church excommunicated them for this, and really only observed baptism, marriage, and the Eucharist, which they only celebrated once a year. The cult spread throughout parts of Europe, and some Waldensians are still around in the Piedmont area of Italy today. The Catholic Church, being what it was in the 12th and 13th centuries, rounded up as many Waldensians as they could. I'm having a difficult time saying Waldensians. Anyways, they gathered these guys up, tried them for heresy, and burned them at the stake. They did worse to the Catharists, who practiced mainly in Southern Europe. They didn't believe Jesus ever existed in the flesh, therefore the crucifixion never took place. And that alone was enough to make the Pope pass out in a fit of vapors. In the early 13th century, Simon de Montfort, Earl of Leicester, and, the English King Henry III's brother-in-law, hunted down the Catharists and laid waste to southern France, killing as many of these people as he could. It is interesting to note he also expelled Jews from Leicester during this time. Sounds like a great guy, right? But don't worry, he got his ass handed to him in battle when he waged war against his own brother-in-law. Factions of the Catharists survived in the Balkans until about the 15th century, when a lot of them took up the Muslim faith. So I do not believe any of them are around today. Did you guys know that the Knights Templar was also considered a cult? They didn't meet a particularly rosy fate either, and that's where we get the superstition behind Friday the 13th. My favorite historical Christian cult, they were known as the Flagellants. No, I'm not talking about farting. I'm talking about they whipped themselves in devotion to Christ. They came to prominence during the Black Death of the 14th century and were marched town to town beating themselves for atonement for man's sin. Because nobody knew about fleas, spreading disease back then, they thought the plague was a punishment from God. Initially, Rome was cool with it until the cult grew in popularity, and then the church was like, no, y'all gotta cut that shit out. After that, there was an inquisition against the Flagellants, and many were tried for heresy. As time went on, any new religion or an offshoot of religion that people were even remotely uncomfortable with was labeled a cult. I'm talking about Mormonism, Quakers, Seventh-day Adventists, Opus Dei, Christian Scientists, and even the Knights of Columbus. If they were different, they should be feared. Today, a cult means something entirely different. Back in the old days, a cult was just a group of people who practiced their religion a little differently than was mainstream. Today, a cult is regarded as a group of people normally led by a charismatic individual who have misplaced or excessive admiration for a particular person or thing. Yes, I looked up the formal definition. Are all cults bad? No. I'm kind of a member of a cult. Sure, it's a fan cult consisting of true crime enthusiasts, but it's still a cult. Look at all the people around the world that, love K-pop, to obsession. They're not bad, They just love Korean pop music and artists and take it to a passionate level. But we're not talking about the love for Asian boy bands or hot cold case investigators. We're talking about dangerous cults. Cults where people are scammed, hurt, or killed because they've been led astray by an individual or group preying on their religious devotion. Okay, Charlie Manson didn't use religion to sway his followers. He used sex, drugs, and the promise of a race war. Y'all thought I was going to say rock and roll, didn't you? But most cults use religion to victimize. Why? Because a god or higher being is the ultimate authority. Most cults use the same techniques to gain and keep followers. They use an us versus them mindset, thought-stopping techniques, so like cutting off thoughts when you're doubting the church. They isolate individuals from their families and friends. They preach apocalyptic fears. They threaten people, like if you leave the church, you're going to hell. They punish people, and they also brainwash. Under those conditions, most people could become victims, especially those who are very devout. Personal note. I am a very spiritual person. I consider myself a Christian, though I don't belong to one denomination. In no way am I out to insult anyone's faith or push an agenda. Your religion, or lack thereof, is your own, and my religion is my own. It works for me, but it may not work for you, so I'm not going to push it on anyone. It's when people push religion onto others, twist their religion to gain power, or use religion to deny other people freedoms is when things get dangerous. So if at any moment you think any of my sarcasm is meant as an insult to religion, it's not. It's just my warped sense of humor, which, isn't always funny. Let's get to our crime of the week, the People's Temple and the appalling events that took place at Jonestown. For this narrative, I got a lot of information from Julia Scheer's book, 1,000 Lives, The Untold Story of Jonestown. Well, let's talk a little bit about Jim Jones. He was born in Indiana in 1931 to a bitter World War I veteran and a drinking and smoking mother. For shame. The Joneses didn't attend church, but a neighbor brought a young Jim to church service one day, and he was transfixed by the minister. Soon after, Jones discovered the local Pentecostal church and, as a social outcast, fit in well with the town's religious outcasts. By 16, Jim was preaching on street corners, talking about social justice and equality in a town where most of the white men had been members of the KKK. But his audience grew amongst the black people in town. By the time of his parents' divorce when he was a teenager, Jim was working at a hospital as an orderly. I'll say this about Jones. Throughout his life, he did have this innate drive to help and serve people. But even as a teen, there was something slightly off about Jones. While upper management at the hospital thought the world of him, his coworkers talked about the unnerving way he treated his colleagues and patients. In 1949, he married Marceline Baldwin, and together they had one biological son and adopted several other children of different races. Jones would call them his rainbow family. Jones would later have a child with one of his parishioners, too. Before becoming a minister in 1952, Jones became affiliated with the Communist Party USA, and that's probably where he began his hatred for the federal government, especially when FBI agents questioned his mother about his communist ties. Remember, this was the time of the Red Scare. If you were even remotely affiliated with the Communist Party or had communist sympathies, you were probably going to be questioned by the FBI. And Jones's affiliation with communism is kind of interesting because communism endorses atheism, and Jones became a Pentecostal minister. He once said something along the lines of infiltrating the church in order to spread Marxism. I don't really buy that. I don't think communism had anything to do with why he went into ministry. I think he went into ministry in order to lead a naive flock. He wanted power. He was seduced by power, and few people have as much power over people's minds and hearts as men of God do. In 1954, Jones opened his very own church in Indianapolis and opened its doors to everyone, including those in the black community, which, as I pointed out earlier, was extremely controversial in Indiana at the time. This church would become known as the People's Temple. Side note, you may think it's weird that Indiana was such a racial state since it's north of the Mason-Dixon line, but there was a time in the early 20th century that more KKK members lived in Indiana than anywhere else in the United States. In fact, at one time, the governor, half of the legislature, and 30% of white native-born men were all members of the Klan. Why Indiana? Both the Great Migration of black citizens from the South to the North and the mass immigration of Catholic European immigrants set a whole lot of white people off in Indiana. They're stealing our jobs! So that became a rallying cry, and membership in the Klan boomed in the 1920s. If you were black in Indiana, you were targeted. If you were an immigrant, you were targeted. If you were Catholic, you were targeted. If you were a black immigrant Catholic, you were screwed. However, the Klan quickly lost traction after its Grand Dragon was arrested for the rape and murder of a schoolteacher. But by the 1950s, the state was still trying to overcome racism and segregation. And that's why Jones was such a galvanizing figure in the 1950s. He advocated for desegregation. He adopted black and Asian children, and he believed in social welfare. The mayor of Indianapolis even named Jones the director of the local Human Rights Commission, and Jones integrated restaurants, amusement parks, the hospital, and even the freaking police department. Believe it or not, Jones pretty much desegregated Indianapolis. To some, he was a Moses figure, and that's how his congregation swelled. And that's how his ego swelled too. Of course, all this wasn't without backlash. Swastikas were painted on the People's Temple Church. Jones and his family received threatening phone calls. And dynamite was found in the church's coal stock, which is actually kind of brilliant and pretty sick as well. Jones also tapped into something else that made people flock to the People's Temple: faith healing. Not just praying for people to get better, but the actual laying of hands. I like how Julia Shears described this in her book. Quote, "Most Christians believe if you enlist other believers to pray for you, your chances of being heard and healed increase. Get a preacher involved, and your chances of bending God's ear skyrocket, who, after all, has more direct line to the Almighty than God's intercessor on earth." She went on to say this gives preachers a magical like quality, which is just another tool Jones used to seduce people to his church. And there were a lot of desperate people who bought what he was selling. Mind you, Jones never healed anyone. The people he, quote, healed were plants in the audience. They were fakes. Friends of Jones would feign ailments and then would magically start walking again, or all their pain would just be gone, or they would cough up their cancer tumor, which was actually a chicken gizzard. Jones was so good at his act, his own wife believed it. About this time, I know a lot of you are asking how the People's Temple is different than some of the more out there churches today. Well, when the People's Temple was in Indianapolis, some people just thought Jones was an over-the-top minister who was passionate about desegregation. But it all started to get strange in 1961 when Jones began to get paranoid and started to talk about Indianapolis being ground zero for a nuclear attack. Once again, this was a really hot time during the Cold War, and the possibility of a nuclear attack coming from the Soviet Union, it wasn't an outlandish idea. Lots of people were afraid of a nuclear attack, especially during the Cuban Missile Crisis. However, the idea of Soviets actually attacking Indianapolis, of all places, was pretty far fetched. Unless the Soviets parked nuclear warheads in Canada or the Midwest, the chances of an ICBM reaching Indianapolis at that time were pretty slim. And it would be pretty outstanding for a Soviet bomber to escape unnoticed through the NORAD fighter nets just to get to Indiana. I'm not saying it wouldn't be possible, but that would be some serious luck on the Soviets' part. So, needless to say, using the idea of a nuclear attack to move your entire congregation to California is pretty damn out there. What's even more crazy, people actually sold everything they had and followed Jones and the People's Temple to Northern California in 1965. By the way, he actually set a date for the upcoming nuclear apocalypse, too, on July 15th, 1967. And just in case you're curious, no, nothing happened. This was also the time he started to scout out properties in Guyana. So it seemed that Jones had a plan. When Jones and the People's Temple moved to California, that's when things started to turn into a cult. I want to give you a brief rundown, or a list at least, of the character traits of a cult leader. There are several of them, but here are some that most cult leaders have in common. They demand blind, unquestioned obedience. They exploit others by asking for their money or that of their relatives, putting others at financial risk. They take sexual advantage of members of his sect or cult. They publicly devalue others as being inferior, incapable, or not worthy. They are haughty, grandiose, and the need to be controlling is just part of their personality. Anyone who criticizes or questions him is called an enemy. They refer to non-members or non-believers as the enemy. He believes he possesses the answers and solutions to the world's problems. He believes himself to be a deity or a chosen representative of a deity. He tries to control others in what they do, read, view, or think. He isolates his members from contact with family or the outside world. He uses enforcers or sycophants to ensure compliance from members or believers. He has taken away followers' freedom to leave, to travel, to pursue life and liberty. He has isolated the group physically so as not to be observed. And this list came from Joe Navarro, who was with the FBI for 25 years, worked in the National Security Division's Behavioral Analysis Program, and wrote a few books, one of which is entitled How to Spot a Psychopath. Anyways, I bring this list up because throughout the rest of this narrative, it's going to be like checking off a list. Let's start, shall we? This move to California wasn't just about escaping the, quote, nuclear apocalypse, but finding out who was loyal and who wasn't. About 150 people followed Jones to California, and the move split up a lot of families. Wives left their husbands and took their children to follow Jones. People ignored the fears of their family members and cut ties to follow Jones. Some of Jones's original followers were just really interested in going to church on Sunday. But others firmly believed in the man, either because they were eating what he was shoveling or they actually believed he could heal their illnesses. Those who just liked going to church obviously stayed behind in Indiana. The others followed him first to California and then to South America. The Temple settlement in Ukiah, California only forced the congregation closer to Jones. There weren't a lot of black people in Northern California town before the congregation arrived, and the sudden influx of black people in the town made some bigots angry, and over 60% of Jones' congregants were black. Whenever the black congregants were verbally accosted, they only huddled closer to the church and to Jones. So close that they listened to Jones when he started to tell them about all the errors he started to find in the Bible. He collected more followers when he told them the Bible was just meant to subjugate women and minorities, and that the Christian God was not actually God, but a false idol. Though Jones never said he was God, he started to encourage his followers to treat him like a god. He didn't tell them to call him God, but to call him Father. He started to preach that socialism was the way to heaven, God, whatever socialist stuff he was shoveling, and that capitalism was a sin. He claimed the Klan and Nazis were out to get all black people, which really wasn't that far off the mark, and that the government would stand by while fascists threw all people of color into concentration camps to die. It was Jones who was the Messiah sent to earth to set them free and to build a socialist society of people of all colors, which, kind of sounds like utopia. This wasn't a sudden reversal in his beliefs. Jones was a crazy narcissist, but the man wasn't stupid. He did this little by little. In each sermon, he gave his followers just, a little taste of what was to come. If you hit them with the whole theory that you're God, they'll probably just look at each other and start making plans to move back to Indiana. Instead, Jones stretched it out over a few years until his congregation bought his wild idea: lock, stock, and barrel. The People's Temple gained more followers by helping people in Mendocino County because, that's what churches do. They helped out recently released mental health patients after Governor Reagan's deinstitutionalization drive. They financially helped out single moms, cured heroin addicts, shepherded senior citizens to doctor's appointments, and even donated the local sheriff's department. They set up their own nursing home and drug rehab center. There were daycares and soup kitchens, not only in Ukiah, but also in San Francisco. This People's Temple seemed like a great place. I think I'll join, which is what a lot of people in Mendocino County and then San Francisco and Los Angeles started to think. The problem with growing your congregation larger is that you will get defectors, especially if you're on drugs and start abusing your parishioners. And Jones was on a lot of drugs. If you want to stroll around town telling people you're a socialist god, that's fine. But people don't really like it when you make them confess their sins or berate them in public, or when you beat them, or when you make their wives perform sexual favors for you, or when you rape them, both men and women. They don't necessarily like when you make them sell their houses and donate the proceeds to the People's Temple, or sign over their paychecks to you, or make them perform hard labor for no pay. Maybe some of the more faithful ones did, but pretty soon, word got out that Jones was a bit of a dick. Not only Jones, but his enforcer group, known as the Planning Committee, who policed those living in the People's Commune areas. Jim Jones owned Goon Squad. So how many bullets have we checked off so far on that list? All of this didn't happen behind closed doors either. He would publicly call out members of his flock and berate them during the Sunday sermons. Not just chastise them, but encouraged congregants to beat the person in question, while Jones giggled and took glee in the public beatings. How did so many people go along with this? Financial dependency, blackmail, and fear. Many of the original members gave up all they had to Jones and had no financial resources to escape the People's Temple. They were stuck. But even if they had the money to escape, they were being blackmailed by Jim, not because he had actual dirt on them, but because many people signed blank pieces of paper, and you can put a lot of stuff on blank pieces of paper. Jones could make it look like you confessed to a whole slew of things, including adultery, murder, or being a pedophile. Jones also scared his congregants into staying by pretty much threatening to find them and kill them should they ever leave. The more he abused people, the more he preached about the enemy. The Klan was the enemy. Fascists were the enemy. Bigots were the enemy. Baptists were the enemy. The dissenters were the enemy. The American government was the enemy. And you can bet your ass the IRS was definitely Jones's enemy. He scared people to stay with the People's Temple even when he abused his flock and used their money to enrich himself and to get stoned. Even while some of this was going on, things were going great for the People's Temple. Before the whisperings of abuse and the fake healings started to hit the press. Before the news stories came out, state politicians endorsed the temple because of their social work. Even First Lady Rosalind Carter visited the temple. I'm pretty sure she regretted that. And also shaking hands with John Wayne Gacy, too. She had really bad luck. All that started to change with the abuse allegations and investigations into the healings. And Jones arrested for jerking off in front of an undercover San Francisco police officer. I'm sure that was pretty embarrassing. So what does a cult leader do when the heat is on? He gets out of town, of course. It would have been nice if Jones had just embezzled the church's money and hightailed it to Mexico. But instead, Jones convinced hundreds of his followers to move down to Guyana and set up a socialist commune where they could worship and work in peace. In 1977, Jones, his family, and around 1,000 People's Temple members settled in the jungles of Guyana to farm and worship Jones. Once there, they couldn't leave. Jones took their money and he took their passports. Almost immediately, family members and parents of those in Jonestown began to enlist the federal government to bring their loved ones home. Some former members of the People's Temple had children in Jonestown in the custody of their ex-partners and wanted their children back in the United States. Some family members were concerned Jones was taking financial and physical advantage of their loved ones. No one could reach Jonestown because Jones and his armed goon squad had the commune on lockdown. In Jonestown, members lived in deplorable conditions. The housing was overcrowded. Members worked long hours farming and constructing. Children were taken away from their parents. The more beautiful female members were made to prostitute themselves in the city for political favors, and everyone was forced to listen to Jones' constant paranoid ramblings. The more drugs he took, the more paranoid he became. He held hours-long, late-night sermons even the children had to stay awake for, and held suicide drills codenamed White Nights. He preached it was better to die than to be taken prisoner by the enemy. Some members still looked at Jones as a prophet. Others were looking for a way to get out. They were overworked, sleep-deprived, hungry, scared, and just wanted to go home. And how was Jones faring in this? Out of everyone in that commune, he was the only one gaining weight. He slept in a nice house with air conditioning and had access to all the food and all the drugs he wanted, and he never lifted a finger working. So I could go on and on about the hell people in Jonestown went through, but I think you already get the gist. It wasn't Jones's promised socialist utopia. It was a dictatorship. And Jones was the god. Everything came to an end in November 1978. The families of some of the temple members finally received attention of the federal government, especially from California Congressman Leo Ryan, who expressed his concern for the temple members. In November 1978, Ryan, members of his staff, news journalists, and family members of Jones's followers flew to Guyana for a fact-finding mission. Jones didn't like this. In fact, when he got the news, he went apeshit and started railing about the enemy coming to get them. He held meetings coaching his followers what they should say to Ryan. You know how everything was terrific, this was paradise, I couldn't imagine myself in a better place. Members of Jonestown gushed to Jones about how happy they were, when in reality they were scared they would get beat if they told the truth. And some of them saw Ryan as their only hope to escape. On November 17th, Congressman Ryan, the journalists, and a few others landed at a remote airstrip right outside of Jonestown, which was practically just a dirt landing strip in the jungle. And Ryan and a few others were allowed into Jonestown. Jones and the rest of the members, they threw a party for the congressman and just wailed about how awesome everything was, and Jonestown was heaven on earth. Ryan was a bit leery, but overall, everything seemed okay until someone passed a note to one of the journalists begging Ryan to help him escape. Wanting to save face, Jones told his flock anyone was welcome to leave, and 15 people, including some children, decided to get the hell out of there. On November 18th, the congressman, the journalists, and the 15 dissenters took a truck to the airstrip where they would fly out on 2 planes. Before they could get safely out of there, Jones's goon squad showed up and opened up automatic gunfire. Congressman Ryan, NBC reporter Dan Harris, NBC cameraman Bob Brown, San Francisco Examiner photographer Greg Robinson, and Temple member Patricia Parks were killed. During the shooting, Patricia's husband told their 2 girls, Brenda and Tracy, to run and hide in the jungle and not to come out until he found them. They stayed hidden for 3 days. The others also hid in the jungle. When Jones received word his thugs were not able to kill everyone at the airstrip, he put white knights into action.
Die with respect, die with a degree of dignity. Lay down your life with dignity. Don't lay down with tears and agony. There's nothing to death. It's like Max said, it's just stepping over into another plane. Don't be this way. Stop this hysterics. This is not the way for people who are socialist communists to die. No way for us to die. We must die with some dignity. Mother, 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 please. Mother, please, please, please. Don't do this. Don't do this. Lay down your life with your child, but don't do this.
Jones and his goons mixed cyanide in large containers with Flavor Aid, not Kool-Aid, and forced people to commit not suicide, but revolutionary suicide. The children were killed first, and Marceline Jones had to be restrained because she did not want the children to be killed. Those who did not drink the poison concoction were forcibly injected with cyanide. Some were shot. At least 85 Temple members escaped the murder-suicide by running into the jungle or hiding. 909 died, and it was the largest loss of American lives in a deliberate act until the attacks on September 11, 2001. At least 300 of those who were killed were children. Temple members living in Georgetown, Guyana, also took their own lives and murdered their children after Jones radioed them and ordered them to commit revolutionary suicide. Jones's 3 sons in Georgetown chose not to take their own lives and even tried to get help from the Guyanese and the American governments. The scene survivors and later military officials discovered was one of Armageddon. Hundreds of people lay around the pavilion once used for gatherings and sermons. Some had been poisoned. Some had been shot. When removing bodies, U.S. Army soldiers discovered the remains of children hidden beneath adults. As if the final moments, parents cradled their children as they gasped and wheezed for air. The United States military collected the bodies of the victims, and the Air Force airlifted the remains to the Dover Air Force Base Mortuary Affairs, where the victims could be identified by family members. Jones's body was cremated, and his remains were spread across the Atlantic Ocean. Investigations did follow, not so much into the cult, but into the State Department and law enforcement when Congress and the FBI found out several tips about the cult had come in before 1978, but it was never really investigated. The Justice Department went after the Temple's assets and found around $10 million, which is something like $44 million today. The government kept $1.7 million for cleaning up and airlifting the remains from Jonestown, and the rest of the money was given to the survivors and others who had a claim to the funds. None of the money was used to help transport the remains of the victims to their final resting places. Many of the victims' families were impoverished and could not afford to claim their loved ones, and even months after the tragedy, Mortuary Affairs at Dover Air Force Base still held several hundred bodies. Even if a family could afford to transport the bodies for burial, many funeral homes and cemeteries refused to lay a victim of Jonestown to rest. Disgustingly, the Guyanese government tried to turn Jonestown into a tourist destination. It failed. Today, very little remains of Jonestown. Many of the buildings were destroyed, and the jungle claimed the rest of the village. The only thing that remains is the psychological and emotional damage Jim Jones inflicted on his surviving victims. Jones's social work in Northern California could have been the start of more communities helping their neighbors in need, more organizations opening up nursing homes, rehabilitation hospitals, and even daycares. But Jones's passion for equality and social welfare took a perverse turn to greed, lust, power, and death. There are a lot of different cults out there. Jonestown is probably the most tragic case among them, though the Branch Davidians, Heaven's Gate, and Warren Jeff's Fundamentalist Church of Latter-day Saints are also horrendous tales of cults gone terribly wrong. Studies average that there are between 3,000 and 5,000 cults in the U.S. today, and you would be surprised to find that some are in your backyard. You may also be affiliated with or know someone who is. How can you tell if you're in a cult? Here's another list for you. If you're not allowed to criticize your leader, even if the criticism is true, you're probably in a cult. If your leader expresses he or she is the Messiah, God, deity, whatever, you're in a cult. If the group you are in suppresses skepticism and you're only allowed to study your organization through approved sources, chances are you're in a cult. If your group delegitimizes former members and has to perpetuate a false narrative that former members were deceived, proud, immoral, or lazy, you're more than likely in a cult. If your group is paranoid about the outside world and insists the end of the world is near, cult. If your group shames you and you need your group in order to feel worthy, loved, or sufficient, you've been drinking the cult Flavorade. If your leader is above the law and you're held to a different moral standard, especially in regards to sex, you're in a cult. If your serious questions are answered with cliches, you found yourself in a cult. If your group is the solution for all the world's problems, you've fallen into a cult. If you're not allowed to know what the group does with their money, you've been financially supporting a cult. If there are secret teachings or ceremonies you didn't discover until after you joined, call your dad, you're in a cult. If you found yourself in a cult and you want to escape, do a few things. Make a mental list of people who can help you. If you live with a cult, pack a small bag with a change of clothes, your ID, phone, and any money or small valuables, but also be prepared to leave that backpack behind if you have to. Don't tell anyone about your plans. Line up a safe place to stay in advance. Escape the first chance you get, and stop attending meetings or gatherings once you escape. Once you have gotten out of there, write down everything that happened when you were in the organization. Focus on you rather than trying to help others escape. Decide whether to involve law enforcement, and find yourself a good therapist. If you think you might be in a cult and want to leave but have no one to help you, please reach out to me at thehistorybehindthecrime@gmail.com or Instagram at thehistorybehindthecrime. There are volunteer organizations that can and will help you escape. I can get you in contact with them and help keep your plans confidential. You are not alone. This week I want to tell you about Kirsten Suzanne Brugman, who was missing. On January 1st, 2021, Kirsten met 4 friends late in the evening at the Irish Mutt Bar at East 10th Street and North Shade Lane Avenue in Indianapolis. They all left the bar around 12:30 a.m. on January 2nd. After an argument over where to go next, Kirsten walked away from her 4 friends who drove off in a car. Because Kirsten did not have a vehicle, she continued walking east on foot. Subsequent investigations by the police revealed she was last seen on a security camera at the parking lot at the YMCA at 501 North Shortridge Road at 1:58 a.m. on January 2nd. At the time of her disappearance, Kirsten was 28, 5'2", 115 pounds. She had brown eyes, waist-length brown hair, and she was wearing a black waist-length coat, blue jeans, black knee-high boots, and was carrying a backpack. Kirsten has a crooked right index finger due to a previous fracture. I'll put up a picture of Kirsten on Instagram. If you have any information on Kirsten's disappearance or know where she is, you can contact the Indianapolis Metropolitan Police Department at 317-327-6160. If you feel uncomfortable going to the police, you can contact me via email or Instagram. Someone out there knows something. You may not, but you might know people in Indianapolis who do. Share Kirsten's story with them. Well, that wraps up this episode. I'll be back next time with a truly Whiskey Tango Foxtrot episode that I am doing a heck of a lot of research on. And it's looking like it is going to be a two-parter. But until then, do me a favor, take care of yourselves, and take care of each other. Bye.